Well, I guess I have to say this is the tie that I wear when I don't know what tie to wear, and don't ask that question. So, I've never tried to. I've never tried to say anything intelligent in 18 minutes before. I don't know how this is going to work out, especially on a topic of the magnitude of the one that I've been assigned, which is to think about Millennium Development Goal number 1. Normally in our research we're kind of burrowed down into some very little squirrel hole of activity, thinking about very sort of micro or minute detailed questions, and to broaden out and think at this scale is something I'm not accustomed to doing. So even though Jim referred to these talks in advance as fabulous, I'm not so sure. Let's find out. So let's think about halving global poverty and hunger. I'm going to take a very narrow line through this topic because I don't have that much time available. And I want to highlight two things, I guess. One is the limited nature of progress towards MDG 1. And the other is a more analytical take, which I'm going to embark on, which thinks about some of the connections between kind of micro and macro growth phenomena and how they fit together and how they might contribute to our understanding of what it takes to reach a target as ambitious as halving global poverty. So I had to go and look this up, of course. What is MDG 1? It has 3 parts. I'm going to concentrate on the first part, which is to reduce by half the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day. In fact, it's $1.25, but let's not argue about details. It has 2 other parts, and the third part, 1C, is kind of, I guess, follows from 1A. That is that if we fix poverty, then we're probably going to fix hunger as well, and I'm not going to discriminate between these two. That's another talk for another day. Then the second one kind of sticks out a little bit, because the second one is about employment. And initially you go, well, what's the connection between employment and poverty? Of course, there are pretty organic connections, and I'm going to pursue some of those today in ways that may be unexpected. So the 2 things I want to do is, first of all, just take a quick scan through the numbers and see what we can learn from that, if anything, and then start to ask in a more analytical way, well, what are some of the things that connect, in particular, economic growth to the reduction of poverty? So let's begin with some of the numbers. These are, I think, very familiar numbers to all of us. If we take the World Bank's preferred measure of $1.25 in purchasing power parity terms per day, then we can see that since 1990 there's been pretty steady progress at a global scale towards the goal that you see down in the bottom right corner there of around about 20%, 21% global poverty by this measure by 2015. Looks kind of good, right? Looks like we're on track to alleviate global poverty. If you choose more generous measures of poverty, that is not as conservative as $1.25 a day, then it still looks like we're sort of on track. If things keep going reasonably well, and if the effects of the current global crisis are not too long-lived. So the big picture, and the one that the United Nations likes to tell us about, is one of progress in a fairly optimistic way towards achieving the goal of halving global poverty by 2015. But of course we also know that this progress is very, very uneven by region. Here are the main developing regions of the world, and as you can see, the little yellow line there tells us the target. You can see that only 2 global regions, that is Southeast Asia and East Asia, are on track, or at least clearly, identifiably on track to meet these goals by 2015. The Southeast Asian region has just matched it now by 2005. East Asia has actually exceeded it, but the rest of the developing world, specifically South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, are still a long way short. So there's a lot of discrepancy in regional rates of progress here, which I think gives us some cause for concern and sets us off hopefully on an analytical track. When we deduct just one of the biggest East Asian, well, the biggest East Asian economy, China, from the data we saw a moment ago, then we start to see a slightly different story. Well, at $1.25 a day, we're still kind of on track to meet the 2015 target, but at any more generous definition of poverty, it doesn't look so obvious anymore. We'd have to really accelerate the rate of poverty alleviation to achieve the Millennium Development Goal of halving global poverty, excluding China, by 2015. And I think that's something that gets us thinking about what's different between China and the rest of the world, and what the rest of the world might do to replicate the Chinese and East Asian generally experience. Okay, So let's just look a little bit more at the data, see what we can learn from that. These are trends in poverty from 1990, the baseline for the MDGs, up to 2005, the last available global data, I guess. We can see that for some regions of the developing world, there hasn't been much progress. For some regions of the developing world, there seems to be accelerating progress, at least in recent years, and that's the way I would characterize sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But when we compare that with East Asia, there's a huge contrast. East Asia, and this is of course dominated, although not entirely, by China, has a poverty alleviation experience that just stands in stark contrast to anything else experienced in the developing world. And as a consequence, of course, the distribution of global poverty across regions has also changed very substantially. So if we go back to 1990, nearly half of global poverty was found in East Asia and Pacific, China, Southeast Asia. And by 2005, that's down to a little bit less than a quarter. Whereas we see that for South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, their shares of global poverty have risen rather substantially. And in fact, there's almost a mirror image between the East Asia Pacific and the South Asia data here. So very different experiences going on. And that leads us to ask lots of interesting questions, of which I can hope to address just a few this afternoon. So I want to kind of take a macro and then a micro line through the data. And without trying to enumerate everything that matters, let's think about some things that are really important. One thing that we know that keeps countries as countries poor is conflict and living in conflict-ridden neighborhoods, bad neighborhoods as economists like to call them. But the things that I want to concentrate on more are geographic and policy isolation. So geographic separation from the rest of the world really matters. We know that Nepal has a very different experience because it's landlocked from other countries. And that kind of landlockedness or lack of integration, lack of geographic, physical integration with the rest of the world matters a great deal. These days we say landlocked doesn't mean having a deep water harbour. It means not having a high-speed broadband connection to the rest of the world, and that's increasingly an important component of geographic isolation. But then the other kind of isolation is something which is less exogenous, something that can be addressed by policy, and that is the kind of isolation that comes from trade policies that turn an economy inwards, force it to produce a much wider range of goods than it would if it were dealing with the rest of the world through trade and through investment, which causes it to give up, to sacrifice the kinds of productivity gains that come from being networked with the global economy in particular, and forces it to raise its own capital rather than relying on global capital markets for that. And this kind of isolation turns out to be really important and is often associated with what we could loosely call growth traps, that is, very low, persistently low aggregate economic growth, which, of course, at an aggregate level, reduces the possibilities for economies to escape poverty. And we know that China's experience in this respect, or East Asia's experience, is very different. Again, there they are, taking off in terms of the growth of per capita income over a very long period of time. And in fact, if we compare these data with the data on achievement in halving poverty at a regional level, we can see that kind of mirror images of one another. Faster growth typically, almost always, means faster poverty alleviation as well. And that's a really important macro point to keep in mind. What about at the micro level? What is it that keeps people poor, individuals, not countries? We know that what we have, each of us, to supply to the world, if you like, the asset that we all have is our labour. And so low labour productivity is really the strongest correlate of poverty. Low labour productivity comes from a lot of different sources, from poor nutrition, poor health, lack of skills, from lack of complementary resources that make us more productive, from the need to produce a wider range of goods than we would if we were able to trade more freely with others in the community or in the global marketplace, so non-specialization, and of course low prices for the stuff that we produce. These things are all sources of low labour productivity, and they keep low-income people poor as a result. And then the other thing, of course, is low opportunity to raise productivity. So particularly because most of the poor in the developing world live in rural areas and depend directly or indirectly on agriculture, then in situ development obstacles, things that prevent agricultural growth, for example, are really important. And you're not going to tell me that's 5 minutes to go. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, right. And also, and this is the one I want to really focus on, is a lack of mobility. The opportunity that's created when you are able, for one reason or another, to move to a more remunerative occupation or a more productive location. And that's the thing that I'm really now going to start focusing in on. We know that when we don't have mobility and when we don't have these other sources of intrinsic labor productivity, then it's easy for subpopulations, local populations, to get stuck in traps in which even if the economy in which they live is growing very fast, they may experience continuing high rates of poverty and very low rates of poverty alleviation. So are these micro and macro phenomena connected? And if so, how? There are many ways in which they're connected. I'm going to focus on what I think, what I believe, and what in my research I pursue as the most important one, and that is labor. Labor is the one thing that we can all bring to the market, and raising productivity of labor is the key in almost every case in the developing world to alleviating poverty. And we can do this through two means. We can do it by addressing intrinsic labor productivity, that is, raising people's ability to work, improving their health, improving their nutrition, improving the local economy. And these are the kinds of things which are done through direct measures. I like to call these the Gates intervention, because the Gates Foundation has really focused on these kinds of micro-level interventions, the sort of micro-connections to labor productivity. But then out there's another whole bunch of sources of labor productivity change, extrinsic to the individual or even the community, and these depend on access to markets, on the prices that global markets set for products that are traded, on technologies that can be exchanged with the global market, and opportunities created by that integration. And these can be addressed by reducing policy isolation, or by deploying macro tools to integrate an economy more with the rest of the world. And of course here we see a very direct connection to the Southeast Asia experience, that their reintegration with the global economy over a period of about 2, almost 3 decades, has been something which has hugely increased the demand for labor, especially low-skilled labor, and that has in turn raised the value of returns to labor. So it's been a very extrinsic story of economic growth in East and Southeast Asia. Not that intrinsic forces have not been at work, but the extrinsic ones, I believe, are the ones that set East and Southeast Asia very much apart from the rest of the developing world. And we can see this a little bit in the data. This is the ratio of trade to GDP. The dotted blue line across the top is the East Asia Pacific. They've always been much more open. And I think that to save time, let's concentrate on comparing East and Southeast Asia, East Asia Pacific, with South Asia. You can see that the openness of South Asia as a set of economies is way, way less all the way through, and grows much more slowly. So openness and integration with the global economy is clearly qualitatively very, very different between East Asia and China and South Asia, as well as the rest of the developing world. And that trend has persisted as well. That's been a very important thing. And this is not just accident of geography. This is also very much driven by policy. What we see in here is one set of indicators of that. These are average tariff rates, so they tell us something about policy obstacles to integration with the rest of the world. We see that East Asia, again the dotted line, is one that starts out kind of low in the group and falls very quickly, whereas South Asia starts out extremely high. So South Asia's integration with the rest of the world is very, very low, partly substantively for policy reasons until very, very recently, and that's associated with lack of economic growth. This is not something that I'm making up about a couple of countries. When we look at data from a whole bunch of countries, all the countries for which we have data, we see the same kind of story. Around about 1990, big changes in global policy everywhere were introduced, and the countries which liberalized, the countries which opened up to global trade and global investment, took off in terms of economic growth. That's the blue line. The ones that didn't stalled or stagnated in very substantial ways. So integration with the global economy is directly associated with economic growth. Economic growth is at least indirectly associated with poverty alleviation. That's my story. We can tell this story at a national level as well. I don't have time to do it in detail. These are two countries that I like to think about in my research and my teaching. Burma, also known as Myanmar, and Thailand. They used to be kind of similar. If you go back to the 1950s, the ratio of incomes was pretty similar. When you crank forwards through the period of the so-called Burmese road to socialism, which involved closing the borders of the country and trying to do it alone, trying to not integrate with the rest of the world, but turn away from trade, while Thailand took the opposite path, then we see this divergence in income, and associated with this, very strong divergence in poverty rates, very strong divergence in wage rates, and all of these things, I believe, are strongly connected. Why does this all work? It works because trade enables specialization and enables us to spend our time doing what we do best. That raises the productivity of labor. It encourages capital flows, including what's important to notice is vertical foreign direct investment, that is, investment which deals in the specialization of tasks across countries according to comparative advantage, rather than the kind of investment which seeks just to capture local market access. So this is an important thing. It raises labor demand, it raises labor productivity, but of course both of these things, specialization, comparative advantage, FDI, are specific to industries and locations. That means that in order to have an impact on poverty, the growth that takes place in specific industries and specific locations has to reach the poor primarily through labour markets. People have to be able to move to where the jobs are being created. Labour markets do that. Market failures, especially labour market failures, constrain that. And this is where I think we have a kind of a under-the-radar source of persistent poverty in the developing world outside of East Asia and the Pacific. Okay, I'm down to 3 minutes. I'm about a quarter of the way through what I plan to talk to you about today. So let's see how fast I can go. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about China, even less time talking about India. I'm going to draw some conclusions. That's where we're heading from here. China, we know, has made terrific progress in achieving the Millennium Development Goal number 1. It's done so primarily by stimulating growth through integration with the global economy, through trade, through task-based investment strategies, and that has opened up a very big gap in wages between urban industrial and rural agricultural regions. There's also been a very strong spatial concentration. So here we get to learn two things about China. One is really rapid growth, very rapid poverty alleviation. The other is they could have done even better. And the reason that they haven't is because they have a legal constraint on labour mobility called the hukao, a residence certificate that prevents you from accessing social security and other benefits, including housing, if you relocate without permission from one place to another. And so, as a consequence, China's very rapid growth has been associated with very rapid rises in inequality. Inequality between the coast and the inland. So coastal provinces look like middle-income countries elsewhere in the world. Inland provinces look like low-income countries. China's disparities have a very strong regional basis. That's reflected in rural to income disparities as well, which have risen very substantially. Some people say of China that it's a country made up of European cities surrounded by African countryside, and these kinds of data support that sort of contention. The difference is still growing. And then, of course, all of that is dynamically augmented by movement of labour. The skilled workers in China can move much more easily than unskilled workers. They do so, and that augments the dynamic differences between these regions as well. The coast starts out with more educated workers and gets more from the inland. Uneducated workers are stuck in the inland where growth is low and productivity remains low. And some of the research I've done with a former graduate student from China provides very strong support to this idea. So what do we learn from China's experience? The switch to labour-intensive manufacturing created lots and lots of jobs. Most of these were in very specific locations on the coast. The residence certificate system inhibited the movement of workers into those jobs. Many moved, many did not move. The ones who didn't move found that their wages were in effect taxed by this residence certificate. And as a consequence in China, aggregate poverty has fallen, but regional inequality has risen very sharply. These are very conditional gains. China could have done better, even than it has. Okay, well, is there anything that we can learn from this about India? India's integration starts much later than China and is much less ambitious. Very slow progress on the kinds of economic reforms adopted by China. Very slow growth until very recently in labor-intensive manufacturing. Not much in the foreign investment, and very little of that of the kind that specializes in hiring low-skilled workers. And so growth has been very concentrated by location and by industry, just as in China. The poverty alleviation story for India is correspondingly rather poor. India alone accounts for more than a quarter of the poorest people in the world. Their ranking among countries is about 153, but when we look more deeply, we find that those indicators are actually only the tip of the iceberg. And in fact, in India, there are substantial differences within the labour market, and specifically between men and women, in terms of the kinds of intrinsic labour productivity attributes that I talked about before. Women's body mass index, India is terrible on this. Child wasting and stunting, they are at Eritrean levels, and India's population is not getting healthier at a very fast rate. They're not showing signs of the kind of thriving intrinsic labour productivity that we see elsewhere. So India's performance has not been stunning on this. And in particular, their labour market has been very, very limited. So there are lots of different sources of immobility, discrimination against women in all dimensions, discrimination on the basis of language and ethnic things we know about. It's a very informal labour market, and that means that there's a lot of search costs, a lot of matching costs in the labour market. It's very difficult for people to get jobs unless they know somebody, or unless they have some kind of informal connection to the potential employer. That discourages labour mobility. It's changing, but it's changing very slowly. Labour-intensive industries are starting to take off very slowly. Labour exchanges, and this is an interesting phenomenon, public-private partnerships have reinvigorated formerly moribund public sector labour exchanges, and they're starting to show real progress in bringing workers together with employers. That's a very interesting trend. And a biometric data system which identifies individuals can help also to reduce some of the uncertainty associated with hiring and accepting jobs in the informal labour market. So these are some possible promising trends that we see taking place in India. So what can we learn from China, if anything, for India and for elsewhere in the developing world? International integration, based on comparative advantage, raises economic growth. Faster growth it raises the probability that you'll get faster poverty reduction, but this is a conditional story. The rising tide need not lift all boats. That is, there is no automatic trickle down of benefits of growth to poverty. Rather, the mechanism that's required to translate growth, which is specific to industries and locations, into broad-based poverty alleviation requires labour mobility, requires people to be able to take advantage of higher productivity opportunities outside of their current occupation, outside of their current, in many cases, their current location. So, if anything, what can we learn from all of this? We know that poverty and low labour productivity, I guess that should say, remain overwhelmingly rural in the developing world. So obviously addressing intrinsic sources of low labour productivity is one really important thing to do. And this is what I've referred to already as the Gates strategy, if you like. They really focus on micro interventions of all kinds, very innovative, very creative, very well funded, and that's great. These kinds of anti-poverty tools should help to raise the intrinsic mobility, the supply side mobility of labour in poor rural areas. But they're expensive to replicate because every time you do an intervention, for example, based on health or something like that, you've got to replicate it lots of other places as well. So the costs of implementing micro programs typically rise at about 1-to-1 with the scale of implementation. That's expensive. And the gains from these may only last if there are indeed productive opportunities for people to move out from their rural area into. What about on the macro side? Well, obviously the big solution there is to raise extrinsic demand, that is to grow jobs outside of rural and agricultural areas. This is a policy which is stimulated by international integration. That's the Chinese experience. There are strong economies of scale in this. You change a policy, you change that policy for everybody, not just for one community, one village, one market. That's a really important source of cost efficiency in addressing poverty. But of course, anything that is accompanied by limits on labour mobility throws sand, slows down the gears of pro-poor growth. And that's what we saw, at least briefly, in the case of China. So what's the answer? Well, I don't know what the answer is. I know that I'm out of time, and Jacob's being very kind about that. So let me finish up very quickly. The answer is that neither the micro interventions alone, nor the IMF solution, the macro interventions by themselves, are going to be sufficient to deal with the problem of persistent poverty in the rest of the developing world. Let me end by proposing some research directions that I think are intriguing to think about. One of these we've already talked about, that is the hypothesis that labour mobility is complementary with both kinds of anti-poverty measures. You can get more efficient, more bang for your buck, if you like, gains from either kind of anti-poverty measure if labour can actually move to where its productivity is highest. So let's take that and just look at two possible ways to approach that from a research point of view. One is international integration has greater pro-poor effects when you also address intrinsic labour productivity. That is, when you tie together the macro changes with specific kinds of micro changes to make sure that people can actually leave their rural agricultural occupation and move to where their productivity will be higher. Here's another one, turning it around. Measures to promote, for example, rural health, that is, intrinsic labour productivity, are also going to be made cheaper and perhaps more effective and perhaps cheaper as well when there is robust growth of extrinsic off-farm, non-rural labour demand. And I think both of these are researchable topics. We don't know very much about the second and third of these hypotheses, and I think there's plenty of potential here for interesting work to be carried on. In particular, collaborations between people who usually think only about micro stuff and those who usually, like me, who usually only think about macro stuff. So I'll thank you for that. If you're interested in the things that I said, then here are some of the references, and if you contact me, I'll be happy to supply them more directly. Thanks.